This is the moment federal authority collided with state sovereignty in the most dangerous way possible. What began as a routine immigration enforcement operation in Minnesota has exploded into the gravest constitutional crisis since the Civil War, with the Pentagon now preparing to deploy active duty troops against American citizens on American soil. At precisely 6:47 a.m. Central Time on January 19, 2026, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin signed orders placing 1,500 soldiers from the Army's 11th Airborne Division on immediate deployment readiness. Their destination, Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. Their mission, to potentially suppress what President Trump has characterized as an insurrection against federal immigration agents. This is not a drill. This is not political theater. This is the United States military being mobilized to potentially occupy an American state whose only crime was defending its own citizens from what many are calling a federal reign of terror. To understand how we reached this precipice, you must understand what Operation Metro Surge really became. What started in December 2025 as a targeted immigration enforcement action has morphed into something that looks more like a military occupation than law enforcement. Nearly 3,000 armed federal agents now patrol the streets of Minneapolis and St. Paul, conducting what can only be described as militarized raids in schools, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods. They are not looking for cartel leaders or terrorist cells. According to the administration's own data, only 5% of the 2,500 people arrested since January have any record of violent crimes. They are arresting dishwashers, construction workers, and taxi drivers. They are terrorizing communities where families have lived peacefully for decades. The breaking point came when federal agents began killing American citizens. On January 7, 2026, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent Jonathan Ross shot and killed Renee Nicole Macklin Good, a 37-year-old Minneapolis mother of three. Renee was not an undocumented immigrant. She was an American citizen, a mother who happened to be in the wrong place when federal agents were conducting one of their sweeps. Video footage from the scene shows her sitting in her car, apparently confused and frightened, when Agent Ross approached her vehicle, walked around it once, then returned and fired multiple shots through her window. The official explanation keeps changing. First, agents claimed she was armed and dangerous. Then they said she tried to run them down with her car. Now they claim she was interfering with a federal operation. What the video actually shows is a terrified woman trying to understand why masked federal agents were surrounding her car and then being executed for the crime of confusion. 17 days later, they killed again. On January 24th, Customs and Border Protection agents shot and killed Alex Jeffrey Pretty, a 37-year-old ICU nurse at a Veterans Administration hospital. Alex was not just an American citizen. He was a healthcare worker who spent his days saving the lives of American veterans. He was at a protest, using his phone to document what he witnessed, when federal agents sprayed him with chemical weapons and then shot him multiple times. The video of his killing is even more damning than the first. It shows a man with empty hands being attacked by agents for the apparent crime of holding a cell phone. When other protesters tried to help him, the agents opened fire. Alex died on the street, bleeding out while federal agents prevented paramedics from reaching him. These were not isolated incidents. They were the inevitable result of a federal operation that was designed from the beginning to terrorize rather than to enforce immigration law. The Department of Homeland Security admits that this is the largest immigration operation ever taking place, but the scale reveals the true purpose. You do not deploy 3,000 agents to a metropolitan area of 3 million people for routine immigration enforcement. You deploy that kind of force when you want to send a message of dominance and control. The message was heard loud and clear in the Twin Cities, where schools began canceling classes, businesses shuttered their doors, and families stopped leaving their homes. Children were having nightmares about masked agents breaking down doors. Parents were afraid to take their kids to school because federal agents were conducting raids at elementary schools. The psychological warfare was working exactly as intended until Minnesota fought back. Governor Tim Walz, who had served as Trump's running mate in 2016 before breaking with him over January 6th, took to statewide television on January 25th with a primetime address that will be remembered as one of the most courageous acts of political defiance in American history. Standing in the state capitol with the American flag and Minnesota state flag behind him, Walz looked directly into the camera and said the words that changed everything. He called the federal operation a military occupation of a sovereign American state. He said that Minnesota would not tolerate federal agents executing its citizens in the streets. He announced that the state would not cooperate with what he characterized as an unconstitutional abuse of federal power. Most importantly, he said that if federal agents continued to kill Minnesotans, the state would take whatever action was necessary to protect its people. The response from Washington was swift and unprecedented. Within hours of Walz's address, President Trump took to Truth Social with a series of posts that can only be described as declarations of war against his own country. He called Governor Walz a traitor. He called Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey a criminal. He said that if the state of Minnesota did not stop protecting what he called illegal aliens and insurrectionists, he would invoke the Insurrection Act and send the United States military to restore order. The Insurrection Act of 1807 has been used fewer than 30 times in American history, and almost never against the will of state governments. It is the nuclear option of domestic law enforcement, the mechanism by which presidents can suspend normal constitutional protections and rule through military force. Trump was not just threatening to send the military to Minnesota, he was threatening to suspend the Constitution itself. The legal justification was paper thin, and everyone knew it. Federal agents shooting unarmed American citizens is not an insurrection. Citizens protesting the killing of their neighbors is not an insurrection. A state government refusing to assist federal agents who are terrorizing its population is not an insurrection. But Trump had painted himself into a corner with his own rhetoric. He had characterized any resistance to his immigration agenda as treason. Now that resistance was coming not just from protesters in the streets, but from the elected government of a major American state. The institutional pressure began building immediately. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison filed an emergency lawsuit in federal district court, arguing that Operation Metro Surge violated the 10th Amendment's guarantee of state sovereignty. The lawsuit detailed how federal agents had effectively commandeered state and local law enforcement resources, forcing Minneapolis police officers to work thousands of hours of overtime just to manage the chaos that federal agents were creating. The suit documented how ICE agents were abandoning vehicles in the middle of busy streets after making arrests, how they were conducting raids without proper legal authority, and how they were targeting American citizens based purely on racial profiling. Most damning, the lawsuit revealed that federal agents had attempted to enter the consulate of Ecuador in Minneapolis without diplomatic authorization, potentially triggering an international incident. This was no longer just about immigration enforcement. This was about whether the federal government could deploy military-style forces to terrorize American cities without any meaningful oversight or accountability. The constitutional stakes became even clearer when Chief U.S. District Judge Patrick Schiltz reviewed the evidence and made a finding that stunned legal observers across the country. Judge Schiltz, a conservative jurist appointed by President George W. Bush, found that ICE had violated at least 96 separate court orders in Minnesota since January 1, 2026 alone. 96 violations of federal court orders in less than a month. This was not law enforcement. This was lawlessness with federal badges. But Trump was not backing down. On January 28th, as the legal pressure mounted and international allies began expressing concern about the militarization of American domestic policy, the president doubled down in the most dangerous way possible. He ordered the Pentagon to prepare for the deployment of active-duty military forces to Minnesota under the authority of the Insurrection Act. The Pentagon's response reveals just how seriously military leadership is taking this crisis. Rather than sending a single unit, defense officials ordered 2 full infantry battalions from the 11th Airborne Division to prepare for immediate deployment. These are not National Guard units that can be federalized. These are active-duty Army soldiers who specialize in operating in Arctic conditions, specifically chosen because Minnesota's winter climate matches their training. The military is preparing for a sustained occupation, not a short-term intervention. The implications of this preparation extend far beyond Minnesota. For the first time since Reconstruction, the United States military is preparing to deploy against an American state government that is operating within its constitutional authority. This is not about suppressing a rebellion or responding to a natural disaster. This is about using military force to compel a state government to assist federal agents who have been killing the state's citizens. The precedent being set here will determine whether the United States remains a federal republic or becomes a unitary state where Washington can deploy military force against any jurisdiction that refuses to comply with federal demands, regardless of constitutional limits. International observers are watching with alarm as America appears to be sliding toward the kind of internal conflict that has torn apart other democracies. NATO allies, already concerned about Trump's threats against Greenland and his attacks on European trade relationships, are now witnessing the United States government preparing to use military force against its own citizens. The soft power and moral authority that America has projected around the world for decades is evaporating in real time as images of federal agents killing American citizens circulate globally. The economic consequences are already beginning to manifest as well. Minneapolis and St. Paul are major economic centers, home to numerous Fortune 500 companies and critical transportation infrastructure. The ongoing federal occupation has disrupted business operations throughout the region, with many customer-facing businesses reporting revenue declines of 50 to 80% as people become afraid to leave their homes. The Minneapolis City Council has documented how the federal operation has forced massive increases in municipal spending on public safety, with police overtime costs exceeding $2 million in just the first week of intensive federal operations. This is economic warfare being conducted by the federal government against one of America's major metropolitan areas. Perhaps most disturbing is the targeting of specific communities within Minnesota. Trump's own statements make clear that Operation Metro Surge is motivated at least in part by his long-standing hostility toward Somali Americans, who make up a significant portion of Minneapolis's population. The president has repeatedly characterized people of Somali heritage as garbage and has specifically targeted Minnesota because of its large Somali community. Federal agents have been conducting raids in schools and neighborhoods with high concentrations of Somali families, terrorizing children and elderly community members who fled civil war in their homeland, only to find themselves under assault by the American government. This is ethnic targeting conducted under the cover of immigration enforcement, and it represents exactly the kind of government persecution that the Constitution was designed to prevent. The resistance from Minnesota has been remarkable in its breadth and determination. The state government, led by Governor Walz and Attorney General Ellison, has refused to be intimidated by federal threats. Local officials throughout the Twin Cities have declared that they will not cooperate with federal agents who are violating constitutional protections. Even more significantly, the resistance has extended beyond government officials to include ordinary citizens who are putting their own safety at risk to protect their neighbors. Thousands of Minnesotans have participated in protests and acts of civil disobedience designed to interfere with federal operations. They have formed human chains to block ICE vehicles, organized rapid response networks to document federal raids, and created sanctuary spaces where vulnerable community members can find temporary safety. This is not just political resistance. This is community self-defense in response to government persecution. The federal response to this resistance has been to escalate rather than de-escalate. Instead of investigating the agents who killed Renee Good and Alex Pretty, the Department of Justice has opened criminal investigations into Governor Walz and Mayor Frey. Instead of reviewing the constitutional problems with Operation Metro Surge, the administration has threatened to expand it to other states. The message could not be clearer. Any resistance to federal overreach will be met with even more extreme federal overreach. This is precisely the kind of authoritarian escalation that constitutional scholars have warned about for years. We are now at the point where the President of the United States is preparing to use military force against American citizens whose only crime is demanding that their government respect constitutional limits on federal power. The soldiers being prepared for deployment in Minnesota are not being sent to restore order. They are being sent to impose the will of a federal executive who has decided that constitutional constraints no longer apply to his administration. The next few days will determine whether the United States survives this crisis as a constitutional republic or emerges as something altogether different and more dangerous. The precedents being set in Minnesota will echo through American history for generations to come, determining whether future presidents can deploy military force against states that resist federal overreach. This is no longer just about immigration policy or law enforcement tactics. This is about whether America will remain America or become something that the founders would no longer recognize. The soldiers are ready. The orders are prepared. The only question remaining is whether cooler heads will prevail or whether we are about to witness the most dangerous constitutional crisis in American history play out on the frozen streets of Minneapolis and St. Paul.